Our next presenter is Brian Anderson. Brian holds a master's degree in medical sociology and is currently finishing medical school. Over the past half-decade, he has conducted anthropological research on various ritual and curative uses of ayahuasca. He is presenting Classifying Ayahuasca, the Role of Subjective Experience in Psychiatric Research with Psychedelics. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. So, that introduction kind of says it all. That's the title of my talk, and I'm going to jump in. So, this is an image from a recent New York Times Magazine piece about the role of psychedelic drugs in therapy for people who are at the end of life. Besides just being a very pretty image and from an article which really gave psychedelics in medicine a very positive review, I wanted just to use this to bring up this idea that psychedelics are sort of slowly making their way into conventional medicine, consideration in conventional psychiatry, and I think this raises a number of questions that we can think about today. I'm particularly interested in these states that psychedelic drugs can induce. What do we make of those? How do we describe them, and how do we understand what they are and what they do to people? The way that psychedelic experiences have been described within conventional medicine have varied quite a bit over the years. I'm not going to go into the whole history, but this idea that psychedelics can cause something which is psychosis or similar to psychosis, that they can be used as tools for therapy, and that it can just induce a spiritual, religious experience. There's a lot of variables that go into how this is actually portrayed in the discourse of scientists and physicians. One thing that we can look at, I think, is of particular interest to research with psychedelics is this idea of the subjective experience itself and how that is incorporated into research. And this can be the subjective experiences of the researchers themselves using these substances and how this influences their work, but also how researchers will pay attention to the experiences of their patients and the volunteers, and what are the constraints that shape how this is influencing what turns out to be the facts and publications and the scientific truth that is created about how these drugs work. So taking an approach, you call it psychiatric anthropology, science technology studies, I want to look at a couple issues that have come up quite a bit in the literature and applied to psychedelics. So anthropology has looked quite a bit at this idea of spiritual experience and how that compares to a pathological experience. When someone goes into a trance state, is this a sign that they are having some sort of mental illness, or is this that they're using their inborn ability to go into an altered state and be that curative? Anthropology has also looked at this idea of what are the determinants that shape how we think about and experience psychotropic drugs, be those cultural, economic, or political. And then when you apply questions like this to the psychedelics, there's a certain controversy that comes up around the question of what happens when you have a spiritual experience around from using a psychotropic drug. This is sort of a touchy point for quite a number of people, and I think when you have a controversy like this, it raises more questions and allows us to sort of take a closer look at what's really going on. Why are there so many conflicting views around that? Just to kind of flesh that out a little bit, this controversy around the overlap of spiritual experience, religion, what is dogma, what is science. A lot of people will blame what happened with this back in the 60s and 70s and the reason why research with these substances and for most of the world stopped officially. As the sort of icon of that is Timothy Leary, our former high priest. And now we've gotten to the point where these substances are being described in New York Times Magazine as appropriate and beneficial substances, but that white arrow right there, that took a long time, and it took a lot of work to get back to where we are. One doesn't come out very well, but one anthropologist who's written about how this came to be that we're able to study psychedelics again, Nicholas Longlitz. His work has been very influential for this presentation that I'm giving you. He looked at how psychedelics came back into research because of the evolution of the cognitive neurosciences and how we were able to use these drugs as tools to figure out what's going on with the mind. This was not a big emphasis on using these drugs in therapy. But when we're going to study the state of the drug and how this is studied within sort of a cognitive neuroscience perspective, Dr. Longlitz wrote a very interesting article about what exactly that state of mind is and how researchers look at it. You can look at the article later if you want, that's the title, but it raises this question of what is the state of mind? Is it something that is caused just by a drug? Is it something that scientists treat as being influenced by our own set and setting, our own personality, and how do scientists deal with this altered state within their labs? Using that as a sort of starting point, I developed my own research, which is not based on how scientists in North America and Europe have been looking at psychedelic drugs, like Dr. Longlitz did, but I chose to look instead at how these drugs are being used in scientific research in Brazil. I looked at Brazil for a couple of reasons. One, because in the country of Brazil, for the last 20 years, it's been more or less officially legal to use ayahuasca in ritual and religious settings. A very interesting article came out very recently by one of the co-authors is here, Bia Labachi. I encourage you to talk to her later or just read the article and then talk to her. That describes the situation and how anyone really within Brazil is able to use ayahuasca in a religious or ritual setting and do so legally, including scientists who want to study these drugs. Also, the case of ayahuasca in Brazil is interesting because whereas if you want to analyze how, let's say, a scientist in Germany is thinking about DMT, what are the effects of DMT on humans, there's not a lot of other comparisons to make about their deductions and what they infer about this state. Whereas in Brazil, you have a lot of comparison with the vast number of experiences that people have had within these churches and other legal settings to sort of contrast what the scientists have to say with what you would say more lay or traditional users have to say about the effects of these drugs. Through the research that I've done over the last couple of years, I've gotten to know a couple of these scientists, and what I'm going to present to you is the results of interviews that I've done with 3 of them. I was not actually able to go to Brazil and conduct observation of the studies that they're doing, but what I'm going to show is the results of the sort of their discourse when talking to me about their work. The few scientists that I'm going to be talking about are associated with the Universidade de São Paulo in Ribeirão Preto, and also at the Universidade Federal de Rio Grande do Norte. So it's a small group of people, really. Okay, just pause. So the first study I'm going to look at is this question of ayahuasca inducing a state of mind similar to psychopathology. And I want to look at the issue of how context plays into this and what I call ontological flexibility. So there was a master's thesis done, published in 2000, or not published, but finished in 2010, by João Porfirio Pinto. In English, the title of this study would be Study on Neurofunctional Alterations After the Ingestion of Ayahuasca. So in this study, Dr. Pinto, who is a psychiatrist, gave ayahuasca to people who have never had it before and then scanned their brains using SPECT He also gave ayahuasca to members of the Santo Daime Church and scanned their brains using an fMRI machine. And he used several scales that they used to study mental illness. They were using scales to study just sort of general psychopathy or psychotic experience, standardized scales for mania, and also for dissociation. This is a picture of what an fMRI machine can look like. This is not actually the machine that they used. It's a machine being used in England for similar studies, but just to give you an idea of what that might be like to be in ayahuasca, lying down in this small tube and having very large and loud motors and magnets whirring about your head. I did that under psilocybin, and that was not very well. It was nice anyway. Going back to Dr. Pinto and his study, what he concluded is that using these brain scans, they actually saw neurobiological activity, which is very similar with ayahuasca naive and ayahuasca experienced people. They had neurobiological activity very similar to what you would see in someone who is in an active psychotic state, who has schizophrenia. This is interesting because when I talked to Dr. Pinto about this and how he sort of interpreted that, he said very clearly that he thinks this is quite different from psychosis, even though the biology looks similar. One reason he said this is not psychosis is because he says that they did not have a break with reality, which by definition, that's the definition he's using for a psychotic experience. Secondly, he says this is not a psychotic experience because he himself has tried ayahuasca, and because of that, he's using that to justify how he qualifies the experience. He told me this about his own experience with the tea. It changed my opinion a lot. It was important. Without having drank, maybe I would not have understood the difference, the line that cuts between illness and altered state of consciousness. It was important. For example, one of the times I drank, I had a flight of ideas. As that one thought led to another, led to another, led to another, and I myself experienced that in a non-pathological situation. I could understand that this was not pathological. What he's describing is actually a very common experience of people who have mania, is that they can't control the speed of their thoughts and they just sort of kind of go off track. And he knows this quite well, being a psychiatrist who treats people with mania, but he was saying even though he experienced that, it was it's the situation that changes how he's going to interpret what that experience really means. So here he's saying he's relying on phenomenology and the context more than interpreting the biology to determine what is the nature of this experience. It's quite interesting. Going back to Nick Longlitz's work, he describes how scientists in Germany who are studying psychedelics will, over time, pay less and less attention to the phenomenology, what people are actually experiencing, in order to justify that they can give a psychedelic to a human, look at the biology, and say that that biology is a good model for psychosis. So there's a difference in how much they actually pay attention to the experience of the volunteer in the study. And then Dr. Pinto gave me this very interesting way of describing it. He says that instead of saying that because the neurobiology is the same, that the experience is definitely the same, he's saying that maybe we just have common pathways. Then the neurons look similar, but they're doing very different things. And so he's doing quite the opposite of what you would normally see when people interpret neurological studies. If they see that the neurons are looking the same, then the experiencing is the same. He's arguing opposite of that. Various reasons for why he might be saying that. I'm not going to go into a lot of this, but we need to take into context when Dr. Pinto is saying this is a spiritual experience, not a psychotic one. He's talking about spirituality as he knows it and has experienced it in Brazil, where, to talk about this briefly, there's a whole history of spiritist religions, and previously in Brazil, it was actually quite common within the medical literature to talk about spiritist madness. People would go to spiritist churches, have these trance states, and be deemed insane or mentally ill. And actually today, it's quite the opposite of that. There are a number of spiritist hospitals, and people can receive care from spiritist mediums, and this is seen as a way of encouraging mental well-being. So this is sort of one of the things sort of shaping Dr. Pinto's qualification of what it means to have a spiritual versus a psychotic experience. Next part. is a study on how ayahuasca might be able to be therapeutic. I want to look at sort of larger structural societal influences on how these scientists are interpreting this. One is what one scientist describes as a sort of inner reality of Brazil as compared to outside of Brazil, not sort of his inner sacred spiritual reality of taking the drug. And then this idea of what is the social imaginary around psychedelics and health, what are the way that we perceive psychedelics and their sort of thought of in culture at large. Here is a nice advertisement for a conference in Brazil, this sort of mainstream academic conference talking about how cannabis is associated with schizophrenia, the pharmacogenetics and interactions of pharmacologic drugs. And then down here at 11:40 in the morning, we have Dr. Jaime Halak of University of Sao Paulo talking about biological therapies, past or future, from ECT to ayahuasca. So right there is part of the main psychiatric conference schedule for the day. Dr. Halak has been doing some interesting work with a number of other people in Brazil. One study that hasn't been published yet in like a typical scientific journal, but has been published in this online book, which you are all able to download for free and read, is evidence from a few studies that Halak and others have done looking at the use of harmine, which is MAOI. Okay, MAOI in ayahuasca, and also just ayahuasca itself being given to, harmine was given to rodents, and then the ayahuasca was actually given to depressed patients. I think it was only 2 or 3 patients total who had not been able to be cured by various treatments for depression, be that pharmacotherapy or even ECT itself. And had in one newspaper interview that Dr. Halake, he said it had fabulous effects, very fast acting, and it sort of brought the colors back to life for these women who had not found relief for their illness elsewhere. 2 other scientists who are carrying this work further, Dr. Draulio de Araújo and Siddhartha Ribeiro, are working in the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte in Brazil, and are going to carry this work with the antidepressant properties of ayahuasca to the next step by doing a phase 2 clinical trial, which is, they were setting it up at the time that I did my interview with them back in June of last year. So some things that come out in my discussions with them about their work, it seems that because there's sort of relatively normative in Brazil to know someone who's drank ayahuasca in a church or to have done so yourself. They really haven't experienced any sort of institutional barriers to doing this work. They say they get space in the hospital. They've been able to get funding. This is quite contrasting to the situation in the United States. Michael Midhofer at MAPS and other groups have had to sort of leave their universities and do their research elsewhere because they weren't really encouraged to do so. One thing of interest is that they're preparing, like Jordi Riba has been doing in Spain, freeze-dried ayahuasca, put into capsules so they can try to do a double-blind controlled study. Except this group is saying that they don't want to call it ayahuasca. They want to separate that from the religious groups out of respect for what ayahuasca represents, out of its sort of cultural currency, and say that is a religious sacrament, and we are not obviously doing a religious ceremony. So to keep ourselves separate and not denigrate their work, we're going to call it DMAUI, or DMT plus MAOI. Also, Dr. Ribeiro makes a point of saying that whenever he gives a talk about this in a public forum, he tells the audience that he has tried ayahuasca. The legality allows him to just share his own subjective experience and be very open about that. In contrast to that, one of another colleague of Dr. Halak we mentioned before, this Dr. Juscelia Jeremias Fortunato, is a biochemist who did her PhD looking at the effects of harmine in rats on depression. And she has this interesting discourse where in patients, she says that if you have what she calls a hallucination with ayahuasca, it's a side effect. if you are an Indian drinking it in a religious ritual, well, then that's spiritual. And then when the interviewer, at least in this one interview that she gave on TV, asked her, what about the churches in Brazil? She's like, oh yeah, well there's that Barquinha church, which is this very small and sort of esoteric church compared to Daime and the UDV. And it was almost like she was sort of diminishing the importance of that sort of experience of the ayahuasca churches. So it's almost like we have sort of here a modern psychiatric patient that has side effect hallucination, a non-modern exotic other who's allowed to have a spiritual experience, and then we're not really sure what to do with an urban modern person who drinks ayahuasca and says it's spiritual. It doesn't really fit. Okay, I'm just going to end soon, but it's so this idea that you can sort of suppress the subjective experience of this complicated figure of the modern person who has a spiritual experience by just giving it less space in public discourse around science might just maybe make it deal with that complexity and be able to kind of make the ayahuasca science fit our sort of imaginary about how psychedelics might work. But referencing Michael Tausig real quick, it's actually often the idea of the other as exotic, as wild, that is curative, and there's this tension between suppressing the idea that a spiritual experience is curative in order to make the biochemistry of it make sense, whereas it seems that modern urban people quite often look to the exotic and the wild as curative. He agrees, and so does he. And just to talk about this, what they're actually doing is they don't, in their discourse, they don't really focus on the idea that the spiritual experience is therapeutic or not, but really they're saying that they want to measure it and actually use biomarkers and use biological proteins to see what is going to determine if this is therapeutic or not. So I'm just going to summarize and say, even with sort of in medical anthropology looking at religious experience not related to drugs, this psychiatrist and anthropologist has claimed that the literature has very little to say about actual religious experience in mental health. We talk a lot about religious communities, religious coping, but there's not been a lot of literature on Judeo-Christian religious experience and how this relates to mental health. Then if that's the truth, then we can't even talk about really what that means to hear the voice of God in sort of mainstream Christian church. How in the world are we supposed to know what the mental health consequences of using a psychoactive drug in a Christian setting, and what does that mean? But it's something we should figure out, because it's already sort of upon us to decide this as a society. This is a quote about the importance of subjective experience in psychiatric classifications of ayahuasca from the president of a church of the UDV here in the United States, from a county hearing whether or not they were allowed to build a temple. And it all revolved around this idea whether ayahuasca is safe or not, whether it causes hallucination or not. And just to share these words, which I quite like, Mr. Bixby says, jumping down here, so the effective ayahuasca tea must not be defined unreflexively as hallucination. I want to be clear, the UDV does not agree that ayahuasca is mildly hallucinogenic or that it's too weak to have an effect. It is not hallucinogenic at all, in their words, and the effect is powerful and is positive. And to really know what the effect of ayahuasca is, you need to take it yourself. So, thank you.
I apologize, we're keeping track of time, so we have time for one question. Lucky one question.
I work with her, so I'm not going to take your question unless if someone else wants to give a question. Jim?
What's the next project?
Graduating. Could I get a real question? Yeah, please.
Like in ayahuasca, it's like, it sounds like they're trying to take the benefit of ayahuasca from the actual process of what an ayahuasca ceremony is. Right? It sounds like they're they're looking for the key, the key ingredients, like pharmaceutical. It sounds like, the pharmaceutical company going down to the jungle and looking for a way to patent
So-
a way to patent the key to the ceremony and then use it in a scientific way. I mean, I understand like that, you know, science does need to study ayahuasca and the effects it has on the human biology, so that we can, you know, so that it can benefit people, especially in our society. But it sounds like, you know, they don't see the whole picture.
Well, that's if I gave that impression, I'm sorry, because there's actually other parts of the interviews that I've done and other data I've collected that say that that's not the case. This group that I'm looking at is actually quite attuned to the contextual influences, and but at the same time, this issue of patents and who owns what and how do you turn something into a medicine is could very well apply, and I didn't go into that, but it's come up before in the world of ayahuasca, and it likely is going to come up again. So thank you.